Today is February 13th, 1975, and I'm interviewing Rabbi Hershel Schechter at 515 Park Avenue in New York.
I was assigned to the 8th Corps headquarters, which in turn was attached to 3rd Army. We had come into Germany in the latter part of March after we had gone through we were stationed in that little town called Bastogne that figured so prominently in the Battle of the Bulge in the closing days of 1944. We're now in the spring of 45, and our whole headquarters kept moving eastward into Germany. I remember vividly that we actually crossed the Rhine Erev Pesach, which was then the very last days of March, and or maybe the 1st or 2nd of April, I don't remember the exact dates. And we kept pushing across the Reichsautobahn until one day I heard from some of the officers that the most forward elements of the tank units that were attached to our headquarters had come upon a place called Buchenwald. I immediately recalled the name. We really had no knowledge, at least I had very little knowledge of what Buchenwald really was. I had heard the name perhaps and had some idea that it was a concentration camp, but we had not as yet encountered any actual concentration camps in our movement eastward. This was in the Thüringen section, right outside of the town of Weimar, the town that was made famous by the Weimar Republic. I jumped into my Jeep and followed directions and came to the site outside of Weimar. As we approached the area, the first thing that struck us was these huge gates that encompassed this vast area beyond what our eye could see. There was one main gate over which were inscribed several inscriptions. One was Arbeit macht frei, and the other was Jeden das Seine. I walked through, came upon this huge open Appellplatz, an assembly point, and the first thing that attracted my eyes that I could recognize without it having to be pointed out to me were the crematoria. I could see the huge smokestacks, and I rushed in that direction. And of course there were people there. Remember, this was on a Thursday afternoon, April the 11th. I'm quite sure that was the date, April 11, 1945. There were many Americans milling around. There was a lot of chaos and confusion, and I, as I said, went directly to the gas chamber, to the crematoria. I saw sights that, of course, are indelibly engraved upon my mind's eye. I will never forget as long as I live. There were piles of human bodies stacked like cordwood, waiting to be shoveled into the crematorium. The crematoria actually were still hot. The ovens were still warm. We could see charred remnants of human skeletons in the crematoria in the ovens. I couldn't tarry very long there and moved on looking for living Jews. And inquiries led me to what was known as the Kleiner Lager. There was a small compound within this huge camp that was apparently reserved only for Jews. It was by far the most dilapidated and run down area. I burst into these long bare barracks, and there again the scenes are indelibly engraved in my mind. There were in the first barrack there were probably a few hundred people who were obviously too weak, too sick, too bewildered to get out of the barracks into the street. They were just lying there looking out at me, half dazed, half crazed, more dead than alive. I didn't know what to say or what to do. All I did was call out in a loud Yiddish, Shalom Aleichem Yidden, ihr seid frei. I was under the impression that many of the people there were not even aware of what had happened. The Nazis left probably less than 24 hours before. And they were so frightened and so uncertain and so insecure, it was impossible to, it still is even more impossible today after 30 years to describe precisely the reactions, but certainly they are very vivid in my mind. I went from barracks to barracks and in each one repeated the Shalom Aleichem and explained that I am an American, that I am a rabbi, and that we have come to help them and that the war is over. And of course I spoke in Yiddish, and they clearly understood and got the message, and I was everywhere surrounded by people who looked at me and then touched me to see if it was real, if I were alive. They examined the little Jewish chaplain's insignia that I wore on my lapels with the Magen David and the Aser Sadibris. And then, of course, an impossible schedule began for me. I recall going first to the American Army officer who immediately took charge of the camp, and he sat in the camp office, and after talking with him for a while and explaining to him that I would like very much to organize a Jewish religious service, especially for the Sabbath, which was the very next day, that Sabbath evening, he was very cooperative and suggested, I accepted his suggestion, got on the microphone. There was a whole amplification system that originated in the camp office, and I got on the microphone and in very simple, hearty Yiddish, I again announced the fact that I am a rabbi and that I'm an American rabbi and that we are here to celebrate their liberation, and that tomorrow evening at a given hour, at a given hall, there was going to be a Kabbalat Shabbat service, that it was to be held, ironically enough, in a large hall that was called the Kinohalle. It was certainly not a movie theater. It was a hall wherein people had been tortured and gone through all kinds of tragedies, but this was the room that was suggested that we use. Then after the announcement was made, and again people rushing around me, and obviously I can't go through, I can't recall every detail minute by minute. I do know that I stayed rather late that night talking to individual Jews, hearing their stories, everyone rushing after me, do I know this one, do I know that one? There were people there from all over. I slowly was able to put together some very minimal kind of statistic. I estimated that there were approximately 5,000 Jews who were still alive in Buchenwald at the time of liberation. Many of them were very sick, were incapacitated, and many more became ill later as the days wore on. I was not able to break down any statistical figures as to countries of origin, I would say that a very large number, maybe 1,000 or more, were Hungarian Jews who had come to Buchenwald comparatively recently. That is, they were there maybe for a year or less than a year, because we know that the deportations en masse from Hungary began in the spring and summer of '44. Many other Jews were there, of course, from Poland, from Romania. There were Jews there, without exaggeration, from practically every country on the European continent. The following day I returned early. My headquarters were in the town of Weimar, and I returned to Buchenwald early that morning, as became my practice for weeks thereafter. And we set up this service. Again, I don't want to become melodramatic to describe the kind of reception that I received at this service. It was held early before dark so that I could get back to Weimar, which was just a short distance by car, before Shabbat. It was very moving. Again, I say it's hard to dramatize. It's not necessary to dramatize the kind of reaction. That hall was packed. There were many hundreds, perhaps maybe even over 1,000 or 2,000. It's hard for me at this moment to recollect the exact number. It was a large hall. It was packed to capacity. There were just bare benches there upon which some sat. Most of the people stood. After that Shabbat, and then we began some semblance of a more organized effort to get things straight. We organized first a small Jewish committee, a committee that consisted of a few people who came forth and who apparently enjoyed the confidence and the trust of many of the others. Obviously, there was no such thing as any kind of election or designation, but they were there. They were natural leaders, and they constituted the committee. I was able to get for them some kind of equipment. The first thing that I felt should be done was to get lists put together. And we provided the simple necessities of the papers and the pen, and we set them up in a little office in this so-called kleine Lager. There was a room that had sort of been used, as I remember now, for the sort of not a hospital, maybe some kind of a dispensary, or some place where they carried on these barbaric experiments on live people. But I remember that room, and that's where we set up the headquarters, or the office of the Jewish Committee, and that's where Jews began to come to register, and we started to prepare lists of names and birth date and place of birth and whatever basic kind of information, lists which I then forwarded immediately to Paris, to the office of the chief of chaplains, to a Rabbi Nadich, who I'm sure was spoken to in this context. He was at that time in the office of the chief of chaplains of the European Theater, and he was my contact, to whom I forwarded all these materials almost daily. We tried to be of every possible assistance. A big effort began with mail. People came, they wanted to write letters. They wanted to let their loved ones around the world know that they are alive. Those who remembered addresses were very fortunate. I told them to write letters, we got paper and envelopes and so on, and then what I did was, there was no civilian postal service. I took all their letters and simply placed them into outer envelopes, which I addressed and set up my return address as though I was sending the letter, and these letters went out through APO, through the Army Postal Service. There were any number of activities that kept going on as the days rolled by. many people, as I mentioned a moment ago, became terribly ill. Every conceivable disease in the world was rampant there, especially among people who had been starved for years and took to eating. The American military were exceedingly kind and brought food, and they overate and became sick again. And unfortunately, a substantial number of Jews died after the liberation. One of the things that I recall we organized was some kind of a Jewish cemetery outside of Buchenwald. There was an area that had been a cemetery, and I had arranged with the authorities to cordon off a small area that was to be used exclusively for Jews who had died. We organized a traditional little Chavre Kadisha, and we tried, under the circumstances, to do the best we could to bring Jews to a decent burial now that they were free. As the days rolled by, shortly thereafter, the second, or I don't recall at the moment whether I think it was the second Friday night after the liberation, we had again a very large service, and I had in reserve substantial quantities of American matzah that I had received for distribution to American GIs. And I felt that this would be something that would be very meaningful, and so I brought these cartons and cartons of matzahs to the service and distributed them, and you'd think I was distributing diamonds, the way the Jews jumped on these matzahs and just crumpled them into crumbs before they could possibly eat them. It was all part of this syndrome, if you will, this reliving. And I remember Jews who very piously and enthusiastically recited a bracha. One Jew got up and recited the bracha Shehechiyonu when he had the piece of matzah, which obviously was the symbol of liberation in the most poignant kind of circumstance.
But there was a question whether you could say Shehechiyonu.
Oh, yeah, that we talked about too. Yeah, one Jew raised a whole halachic issue whether it's proper to recite the Shehechiyonu under such circumstances that are accompanied by so much pain and suffering. That was a very beautiful moment for me.
Because what was the reasoning?
Yes. The Talmudic argumentation was that according to the din, we do not recite a Shehechiyanu for any occasion, even though it normally would fit into the category that warrants Shehechiyanu, whether it's an occasion that comes misman lizman, or an occasion of great rejoicing that we thank God that we achieved. But there are circumstances that are very joyous, and yet we do not recite a Shehechiyanu, such as at a Brit Milah. The father of the baby does not recite a Shehechiyanu. Why? The Gemara says because Tza'ara diyenuka, because the baby is suffering pain, and also because the mother endures so much pain in childbirth. So a joyous achievement that is accomplished through pain, that is achieved only as a result of accompanying pain, even though it is joyous, does not warrant a Shehechiyanu. And this was the reasoning of this Jew, a rabbi from Budapest, as I recall now, said to me very modestly and very humbly, a very self-effacing, truly almost saintly person, said to me, "No, our freedom came with so much pain and suffering that I don't know whether it is really proper to recite a Shehechiyanu." Many days passed, the festival of Shavuos came up, and we still celebrated, and there were thousands of people. That I remember very vividly. The services on Shavuos, I stayed in the camp. By that time I had become practically an inmate in the camp. I had quarters there, I stayed there. And I remember we were there the whole Yom Tov of Shavuos, and I remember arranging for a kiddush after the service. I remember particularly that the Yiska service, that was something that was, again, one of those gripping moments, the anguish, the cry. This was the first Yiska that Jews were saying after those whom they had left, and to recite Yiska in the shadow of the smokestacks of the crematorium. It was a remarkable experience. Generally, the level of religious observance was very interesting. There were, my experience has been, in fact, not only at that moment, but over the years, I've thought a great deal about this. My experience has been that, by and large, obviously there are always exceptions, but by and large, the Jews who were really from before the Holocaust came upon them remained religious and committed and observant in spite of all the agonizing problems that they had. And those who were not, did not become religious, obviously, as a result of these experiences. But there were a number of very pious Jews. There were Jews who for whom I brought talesim and tefillin, whatever supplies I had with me as an army chaplain that were intended for use by American GIs. Obviously the GIs, those who really needed them and wanted them, had them, and the rest didn't really care. So there was no question that the purpose to which I put them now was much more appreciated than if they had gone to GIs. The little GI, American GI prayer books, the Sidurim, the whatever, I had a supply of little mezuzahs, you know, these little token mezuzahs that are carried around the neck. They grabbed them, they fought over them. It was anything that smacked of anything Jewish, of tradition, that reminded them of home, that renewed their ties with a world Jewish community. These were all manifestations that they jumped at and wanted very much to hold on to and to be part of. What else did we talk about? Talking about distributing these prayer books. I remember one incident, again in this sort of religious context. There was one occasion, I believe that it was on May 1, on May Day, which for many leftist Jews who were among the inmates was a very significant day. It's a great workers' holiday. And a big assembly was arranged by the people there for Jews, for young Jews, and interestingly enough, they asked me to speak, to address this assembly. And I did. And it was quite a clash because the communists among them, and there were some very wonderful people, I say this without any reservation, there were some communist Jews or Jewish communists who were superior people, who really were great idealists and who gave of themselves to help others. But of course they spoke to the children and to the young people and to whoever was there in terms of turning eastward, back to Poland and to the communist world and to Russia, and that's where the salvation of the Jewish people would be. And I, of course, took an entirely different position. I spoke about then Palestine and Zionism and a religious revival and a world Jewish community that was waiting to help them and so on. And at that occasion, I remember I also brought with me some of these, whatever I had left, some of these little sidurim and mezuzahs, and began to distribute them, and they ran for them, and really, again, as though I were distributing diamonds. And I remember vividly one of the older men who was a very committed communist got all excited, and he started to yell at these children. I clearly remember his words, "Zu wem davent ihr? Zu dem Gott, was hat geworfen meine Taten und Mammen in Krematorium." It was difficult to counter such arguments, but the fact remains, as I said earlier, that those who had a measure, and the overwhelming majority of them had some measure of attachment. There was a feeling of kinship, of affinity for Jews, for the Jewish people, for Jewish tradition, even among those who were not terribly religious and committed in a ritual sense, but there was certainly a commitment to the Jewish people, and if anything, the thrust was toward rejoining and rebuilding a Jewish life for themselves in Jewish communities, rather than moving in to the world of communism and that kind of solution to the Jewish problem. Where else? In line with this was another very interesting development that merits our discussion, and that is the formation of what was known as Kibbutz Buchenwald, where there were a group of young people who came to me and said that they had been members of various Zionist youth movements before the war. Many of them were on Hachshara, were ready to go to Palestine, and they wanted, if possible, to reorganize and reconstitute this kind of Hachshara. Initially, I was very successful, I must say, in persuading the commander and generally the G5, the Civilian Affairs Department of the American military, the civilian government, to allocate a farm, which these people took over and began immediately to work as a hachshara. Their internal organization was really exemplary. There were so many of them who represented the whole spectrum of the Jewish world, of the Zionist world, from, I would say, from Poalei Agudas Yisrael through Mizrahi, labor Zionist, Shomer HaTzair, revisionists, the whole spectrum of Zionist ideology, and yet they lived together and worked together harmoniously. It was really a delight. As a matter of fact, they stayed together as a group even after Buchenwald was evacuated. Maybe we ought to hold that, or let me put that in right now, we may forget it later. Buchenwald functioned more or less until the latter part of May, I think it was, early June, when, here, this June 13th is when, yeah, good, we have this form here from a memo from the files in YIVO that was written by the first JDC team that came into Buchenwald. From mid-April until mid-June, those 2 months, Jews kept coming and going. Some Jews decided to go back eastward, to go back to Hungary or to Romania or to Poland to seek. Maybe they will find somebody. We organized, as I said earlier, when we got these lists together, we sent them to Paris. We received lists from other camps and sent lists to other camps, principally to Bergen-Belsen, that was up in the British zone. We worked at that time to try to bring some semblance of order. I mentioned the mail that I had sent out and was beginning already to get replies. And finally, word reached us. There were several developments. One, a smaller development that I referred to a moment ago about Kibbutz Buchenwald.
Excuse me, according to a JTA report of April the 30th, it says that 60 men who thought themselves Belgians today watched the departure for Belgium of a group of Buchenwald internees while they remain in the barracks here, wondering where their country is. It seems that a number of Jews were going back.
Yes, I just said that. There were Jews who went back
to the west as well as the east.
Correct. That went back to the countries of their origin in the hope of either finding remnants of their families, in the hope of finding remnants of the personal fortunes that they may have left behind, in the hopes of being able to reestablish their roots. This was a perfectly normal thing which we all encouraged. Well, it depends. I shouldn't say we encouraged it en masse. There were some whom we encouraged to stay and move westward rather than to seek to rebuild their lives in the East. But there's no question that the Jews moved out and other Jews came, because Buchenwald at that point sort of became the center for Jews from other camps and from other slave labor camps that were in the area, smaller groupings of Jews. Interestingly enough, it's almost like from nowhere, girls and women began to appear, because in Buchenwald there never were any females. It was a strictly male camp. But Jewish women and girls heard that there were Jews in Buchenwald, and they were liberated in all kinds of places, and they made their way to Buchenwald seeking the security and the comfort of fellow Jews. So the first, the developments were, as I said, Kibbutz Buchenwald, and then the big development was the UNRWA transport. We got word that the Swiss government was going to permit 500 young Jewish children from Buchenwald to Switzerland. And a team came sent by JDC out of Paris, together with a nurse from Switzerland, who were to supervise this transport. It was a very chaotic kind of thing, but this nurse insisted very cruelly that only children up to the age of 15 or 16 were to be admitted to this transport. Well, that was absurd. First of all, there were no 500 Jewish children alive who were under the age of 16, not only in Buchenwald, but in half of Germany. And secondly, so many other people who were perhaps a little older, maybe in 18 or 20 or 22, who had birth certificates, who knew. She attempted to interview each one individually and rejected many, and there was a whole hassle. Finally, we loaded that train, and I went along with that train. She didn't go on the train. She either flew back or made her way back otherwise. It was a long story. I don't know if we can go into all the details of that transport, because it was certainly a very remarkable experience. Those youngsters to whom she approved of, she issued a little card with some kind of a rubber stamp that indicated approval. And those whom she rejected, of course, were rejected. I quickly got to work and took this card with the stamp on it and went into town and had the boys arrange to duplicate the rubber stamp that she had, and she issued her stamps and I issued my stamps, my cards, with the same identical rubber stamp that no one could tell the difference. And then when the train began to move, it was absolutely overloaded. There were many hundreds of not just children or not even just young people. There were people in their 30s. There were mothers with grown daughters. There were fathers with sons.
To be part of this
and these were all part of the 500 under 16. When we finally arrived, I think the city in Switzerland, I mean, the ride itself, all the tracks were all beaten, and it was a very difficult kind of ride, but we finally made it.
What were you able to do on the train for them? Were you able to help them in any way?
Well, the army had provided rations. There was food for them on the train, and we sang and we tried to keep their morale going. I was there in a very official capacity. After all, I was an army officer. I couldn't just take off and go, but I had orders that originated in SHAEF headquarters, in the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, signed by Eisenhower, if you will. But the trip was an interesting one. We finally got, I think it was to Bern. I don't honestly remember. I think it was Bern, the city that was the destination of this train ride. And of course, when we pulled into the train station, we were immediately surrounded by Swiss police, and I was the spokesman, and they had been notified of what had happened in Buchenwald, that all these people just went on the train, and they were determined not to allow this train or the passengers on the train to come down. And of course this would have been a horrible, horrible tragedy if all these people who had miraculously survived all the tortures of hell, and now they were ostensibly free and would again be faced with this horrible disappointment and frustration that they could not get off the train in Switzerland. I ran, as I recall, I begged for a few hours, and I asked to be taken to the synagogue, to a rabbi. I finally got to the leaders of the Jewish community, and they in turn intervened with the Swiss authorities, and we finally were able to arrange for these people to get into, to be admitted into Switzerland, but they were placed into different camps, and there were a whole group, various leaders of different Jewish organizations, beginning from the World Jewish Congress, and then the Zionist Palestine Office and other Zionist organizations and relief organizations, all became involved now in trying, obviously and properly, to be of help to these Jews who were admitted into Switzerland after a great hassle, but they finally were admitted and placed in various camps and various homes, and many of them made their way ultimately to Palestine, and from there many went off to different parts of the world. I must tell you that in the course of these years, I too have traveled extensively. I've been in many areas of the world, and it's a wonderful feeling for me to meet people who remember me from Buchenwald, in Israel, of course, but in far-flung places in various cities in Europe. A number of years ago, I was on a visit to Australia, and in Melbourne there's almost a colony of former Buchenwalders who, for whom I was the great hero, and they wined me and dined me. It was a very fascinating experience. So this was Switzerland.
Excuse me, can we try to be a little more specific about what took place with regards to you and the Jewish community? How did you get to them? You went to this rabbi in Bern?
I went to a rabbi. I honestly don't remember his name. He was a typical German rabbiner, very slow-moving, and here I was a young fellow at the time. I was tearing the house down. To me, this was a matter, and it was literally, of life and death. He took his time, but I really, it would be difficult for me to reconstruct the details of how this came about, but it did. And I remember I spent a few days in Switzerland after this train incident and visited with various dignitaries. There was a meeting that I had with a Dr. Riegner, who is still to this day the Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, and other Jewish leaders who were very anxious to get involved and wanted to get more Jews out of concentration camps and DP camps that were beginning to get set up. But on the whole, after my experience in Switzerland, I had to get back to my headquarters. What had happened, the other development that is very significant, is that the agreement, this was on the highest level, as I understand, I think that this was an agreement that was reached at the Yalta conference with the no, maybe not the Yalta conference. Where was the Potsdam conference with Truman already? The Yalta conference was still with Roosevelt. That Eastern Germany would become part of the Russian sphere of influence, so that this Buchenwald camp, which was in the Thüringen sector of Germany, which is East Germany, was to be taken over and occupied by the Russians, and all American troops had to move back westward. And this was to take effect, this was to come into effect as of the 1st of July, 45. Now there were many, many Jews who sure did not want to remain in Buchenwald under the Russians, who wanted to get out of there as quickly as they could. And so we were active in organizing various transports.
Who's we?
We were actually it was the assignment, the work of the American military authorities. The problem was a very an interesting problem. I don't know whether we spoke of it last time. The problem that the American military authorities had in handling all of these issues, the Jewish problem. Did we talk about it last time?
To
I remember that when I kept coming to this colonel who was in charge of civil affairs.
Whose name was?
I don't know. I can't recall. A real typical middle American, Midwestern kind of a guy, a decent, very decent human being. And he was quite helpful to me, although remember that this was not my responsibility. In fact, I had a lot of trouble with my senior, the superior, my immediate superior was the senior chaplain for this 8th Corps headquarters, a Catholic priest, whose name Wachler, I really don't remember. But he was not a nice guy. Maybe that's why I don't remember him. He was a pretty mean sort of a man, and he couldn't understand why I was not conducting more services for American Jewish GIs who at that point couldn't care less. The war was over, practically over. I mean, they were busy running around looting and doing whatever they could, and they weren't at all interested in services. And here were these thousands of people who were literally dying for my time, for my attention. And he said to me, I remember once, he got very angry, and he said, remember, you accepted a commission in the United States Army to serve American military personnel, and not this. Matter of fact, his anger cost me a promotion. I left with the same rank that I came into his headquarters. But that, of course, is unimportant. I told him that whenever I got angry at him, I called him father. I said, you know that there are a lot of Catholics there too. I think it would be nice if you would go over and offer them some spiritual ministration. And of course he was drunk half the time and couldn't care less.
Was the man's name Tiernan?
No. Tiernan was the top boss. I remember Tiernan. Tiernan was Judah Nadich's boss.
Oh, because Tiernan was also known for that.
Well, most Catholic chaplains had a good time on Saturday. Then they slept Saturday night, and Sunday morning they were ready for Mass. The Tiernan was the senior chaplain for the ETO, the European Theater of Operation. My guy was the senior chaplain for the 8th Corps headquarters. In any event, I paid very little attention to him, and where was I? Yeah, the colonel in charge of civil affairs. He understood that this was not my responsibility, and yet was extremely helpful and cooperative. I remember one very long, heartfelt discussion that I had with this man. When he said to me, he says, Chaplain, can you explain one thing to me? Before we came over, we were trained in this whole area of civil affairs and civilian government, and we knew what to expect, and there were contingency plans for almost every possible development. And we knew that we're going to come into concentration camps, and we're going to find people from different countries, and there are precise regulations and general directives and guidelines as to how to handle these people. But nowhere in these guidelines is there any discussion about Jews as Jews, what to do with Jews. Yeah, of course, there were mention of Jews. We knew that there would be Jews in these concentration camps, but Jews who came from Poland or Romania or Hungary, wherever it is they came, and we were instructed to encourage the inmates to return to the countries of their origin. And here you tell me that Jews don't want to go back to the countries of their origin. And you keep asking me to provide military vehicles to take them westward, to take them into West Germany, into other parts of Europe. I had to sit with him for hours, but I think I explained and convinced him why Polish Jews cannot go back to Poland. To the Poland where they lived for 1,000 years. But that this chapter was finished, how Polish earth was drenched with Jewish blood, and the Jews couldn't and wouldn't ever go back, they had nothing to go back to. But this was an interesting development. It was a very, very powerful lesson for me in Zionism. I was a Zionist all my life, but that certainly made a Zionist of me, if nothing else did. All right, so Jews began to move out. And this movement began even before I left on this transport in June to go to Switzerland. And they kept moving out to various sites where the American government set up what became known as displaced persons centers, the DP camps. This, interestingly enough, this kibbutz Buchenwald also moved out as a unit, as a group, and was set up in a hachshara, this almost poetic justice. There was a Zionist hachshara camp, farm, outside of Fulda, which is not far from Frankfurt, in West Germany. And some of the people in Kibbutz Buchenwald knew of this place, and they said, wouldn't it be beautiful if we could go right back? And sure enough, it was set up, and they went right
How was
back.
it set up?
Again, military government.
You did it or they did it?
This I think they did, because I was away in Switzerland. I don't take credit for that particular transfer.
But Kibbutz Buchenwald you were involved with.
Yes, very much so.
You were the one that got him the land.
That got the initial farm near Weimar.
Right.
And that got them a lot of equipment and got them the Hershel, the formal approval that what they were doing was not illegal, that these were not thieves in the night who were simply occupying a property that was not theirs.
So you never were called upon to do anything illegal?
Well, illegal in that setting, in those first weeks, days after the initial break, the line between legal and illegal was very, very hazy. The Jews used to say, the Polish Jews used to say, "Medarf organisieren." To organize something meant to loot. And there was a tremendous amount of looting. I was not personally directly involved. The extent of my looting was that I used a lot of army. I went around collecting from American GIs, Jews and non-Jews, extra uniforms, trousers, shirts, socks, chocolate, cookies, drinks, and I kept distributing. I always had a tremendous supply in my Jeep, and people came and just helped themselves. The American Army provided for these people, for the inmates in the camps. The set up kitchens, and there was more food. In fact, they ate too much, and so many of them, as I said earlier, got sick.
What about guns? Were you involved in any way with
No. This was much too early. This was before the Bricha and this whole chapter. I was not involved in that at all. Because so let me finish then. When I came back to Buchenwald, and it was a real hassle to get back because I was already in Russian territory. But I did come back to Buchenwald because I had no knowledge where my unit was. And I was really, at that time, I was already probably AWOL. I was traveling without orders. But I got back to Buchenwald. I remember borrowing jeeps and hitching rides, but I got back and went straight to Buchenwald after getting into Weimar. I got into Weimar, I didn't see an American face anymore, and went straight out to Buchenwald, and there was already this big, huge sign in red letters, Es lebet Stalin der Befreier Europas. Stalin, the liberator of Europe, and, hail the Red Army, and so on. I went into Buchenwald, into my old haunts, and I found nobody. There were just a few Jews hanging around. There was one Jew, I remember very vividly, his name was Baruch Goldberg, a Polish Jew who was a very avowed communist, and who was one of those who were, working with the children and trying to persuade them, and he wouldn't leave when all the Jews, the overwhelming majority, I'd say 95% of all the Jews, left those last few weeks in June to get out of this whole sector before the Russians came and took over. He and very few others remained. And he assumed, that the Russians would welcome him with open arms. They'd carry him around. He is their great emissary. He's their hero. Well, nothing was further from the truth. They didn't even look at him. And he knew Russian, and he tried to talk to these people. Nobody paid any attention to him. He was so disappointed and frustrated that he pleaded with me that I should take him along now when I go westward, when I catch up with my unit, which I did. Because I did manage to wrangle a vehicle that I used for my own personal travel. We got back out of Buchenwald, and I went back. I finally caught up with my unit in some town in Germany, and then lo and behold, my unit was alerted to, this was in early July, my unit was alerted for service in the Pacific. The Pacific War was still going on. So I was desperate. I was so anxious to stay because I had too much work to do. I wasn't ready to go back home. But of course I had no way of getting out of my unit. I couldn't be transferred into any other unit. There was a lot of red tape, and so very reluctantly I came back to New York the very end of July or the early part of August. And then of course a few weeks later, when was it, August 14 or something, the war in the Pacific ended. So that was the end of my involvement in combat. I still hung on. My unit went out to Texas, and I was not actually separated from service. First time I put on a civilian outfit was in January. Mm-hmm.
It's January 1946.
Yeah.
Okay, now, fine. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I think this is pretty...
What about your involvement with Rabbi Robert Marcus?
Yes, are we still on?
Yeah.
Rabbi Marcus, Alav HaShalom, was assigned to the Air Force. I was assigned to the Army. He was a chaplain in the Air Force. And quite by chance, just as my unit came into Weimar, his unit also came into Weimar. And he too was a very dedicated person, became very active in the work. I don't know that, as I recall now, he was not there as regularly. He had to travel more, but he was in Buchenwald with me. He came in, I think, a few days after I did, but was extremely helpful and cooperative, and he led a transport of children from Buchenwald to France. And almost all of those whom he took to France went directly to Israel. He came back. Unfortunately, he passed away quite a few years ago. I don't know exactly when, but he certainly wrote a very meaningful chapter. His contributions were very substantial in terms of that kibbutz Buchenwald he helped, and generally he was very helpful.
Now, you also were involved with Rabbi Tzemach.
Yeah, well, just on one occasion when I went again looking for Jews and looking for somebody told me that there was a group, what was formerly some kind of a slave labor camp or a factory where there were a number of Jewish girls. Mm-hmm. And I went looking for them in that town, and that's where I met this Rabbi Zimak or Tzemach. I knew him before, but we hadn't crossed the paths until then. And my only contact with him was that when we were putting together this transport to go to Switzerland, and I was so short of young children, I reached him, as I recall, I don't even remember, I think that he brought or sent a number of girls to join this transport to Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were also very critical, not also, but you were critical of the JDC during this period.
Yes, yes. Now, I was and am critical of JDC in that moment because from where I sat, it seemed like it was millennia till we saw anybody from JDC. Undoubtedly, I'm sure that as anxious as I was, and as anxious as all the Jews in Buchenwald, say, were to see somebody from the joint, and everybody knows joint, you know, Jews in Eastern Europe knew joint. As anxious as we were for them to come, I'm sure they were just as anxious to come. They undoubtedly were hamstrung with all kinds of bureaucracy and red tape that it just wasn't easy for them to pick up and come. Actually, it was not until mid-June that anybody from JDC came to Buchenwald, and the kind of people that came left much to be desired. None of them knew Yiddish. They were just not of the kind of background that would be helpful. Maybe I'm being super critical in retrospect, but at the time I was disappointed with the caliber of the committee. There is some references here to this. I still haven't read it carefully, but these people who came obviously with the best of intentions. I left them in Buchenwald when I went to Switzerland, and when I came back, of course, they were gone with almost all the Jews.
How would you characterize your role during this period as a chaplain? What did they do? In other words, what do you think would have happened had you not been there?
Well, that's a very awkward question. I don't know. I'm sure that things have a way of getting done. It's hard to say. I can only say what little I tried to do. If I were not there, perhaps others would have been there, or if not a Jewish chaplain, a military person, maybe some leaders would have emerged from among the former inmates themselves. Overall, I think that the one real criticism that should be leveled is the fact that world Jewish leadership, whether in terms of JDC, whether in terms of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, whatever world leadership there was at that time, was really not prepared. There were not adequate contingency plans. There were not adequate personnel trained. There was not enough pressure exerted on military governments, on the civilian governments of the Western Allies to move in. It's tragic enough that there wasn't enough pressure exerted during the war to do some of the things that Jews wanted the American and British governments to do. But certainly after the war, I have a feeling that more could have and should have been done.
That's all I have. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No,
Was there any area that we haven't touched upon that you felt...
not that I could recall, really.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Right, you're very welcome.